Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I want to discuss a subject that has continued to come up every single time I'm reading through the Cell Saga of Dragon Ball Z, and additionally talking about the various timelines, which I've done a lot of on my channel recently, along with the Cell Saga. Boy, I talk a lot about that part of the series, don't I? But nonetheless, what I'm going to be discussing today is the question revolving around Android 16, and more specifically, where exactly is Android 16 in the other timelines of Dragon Ball, and the future timelines, and really all the other ones that we've been introduced to that aren't just kind of copy of what we're currently seeing. So I'm going to be getting into that in the manga, and additionally I'll be discussing what if he actually was there, and how would he have really contributed. So let's get into that right now. But before we begin, if you like this video, please make sure to leave a like and also comment your own thoughts down below. Maybe even share this video out. It really helps the channel, and it'll help this video to be seen by more people, and then in turn I can make even more videos like this. But let's get into the video. Okay, so for a little bit of backstory on Android 16, we were first introduced to him during the early part of the Cell Saga, in which Dr. Gero went back to his laboratory and woke up Android 17 and 18, being under the false premise that he would be able to control the two of them, because the fact that when they saw that remote shutdown device, they immediately started to pretend that they were being his loyal servants. Now, of course, what ended up happening was that the Saiyans and friends knocked down the doors, which led to the revelation of 1718 to them, and the confirmation as well of exactly who these are. Now, this would only continue to go from here, because what ended up happening was that they get into a discussion where the androids and Dr. Gero are arguing. Dr. Gero is saying that they were too powerful for him to control, which is why he put them under. And then at this point, what ends up happening? Well, while Android 17 and Gero are discussing this, 18 looks and sees 16's pod, and sees him still dormant and asleep within there. And she says, "This is also an infinite energy model, isn't it? But he's not like us. A little bigger for one. How else is he different?" And what exactly does Gero say? He doesn't even answer her question. He says, "Don't touch that number 18, just back off." And then Trunks, interestingly, says number 16, "I never heard of a 16. So this confirms early on, and then we see other examples of this, that 16 did not exist or was not activated in future Trunks' timeline. And I'll get into a little bit more as to why that might be. So 17 wants 18 to start him up, but Gero immediately warns, "Stop, you mustn't. Do you want to risk destroying the whole world? 16 was an experimental model and a failure. Don't activate him." Now, interestingly, 18 brings this up. "You've left him around quite a while for a failure. You disposed of all the rest up through 15. And Gero says, I was going to fix him later. Just don't activate him. You're going to kill all of us." Now, this kind of is a question that comes up and is raised here. Why really was Gero waiting to activate him in the future and was still working on him? Because, as we know, the thing is that 16 is actually a way more peaceful, kind-hearted android. He's not like 17 and 18, where he rebels against Gero in the sense of wanting to kill him or go against what he was programmed to do, but rather he's somebody who, you know, kind of like the Terminator in Terminator 2, who Gero, you know, must have seen, because we see 16's heavily inspired by that. The fact of the matter is that he learns to understand the value of life, and then in turn doesn't want to take it, especially natural, like, you know, animalistic life. So, you know, maybe that's the real reason he put him under in the first place, when he considered him a failure. But with that being said too, I don't really think that he was ever going to kill all of them, unless maybe Gero actually overcompensated, and when 16 was originally created, he was like super violent, and so he overcompensated to make him less violent, and then in turn he ended up basically being a pacifist, except for when it comes to Cell and Goku, which I'll get into in a little bit too. But nonetheless, you know, Why was Jiro still working on him and didn't dispose of him? Well, Toriyama does explain this a little bit more, in interviews outside of the manga, where he said that Jiro actually based 16 off of his son, who was killed a while back. Some people speculate he was killed by Goku, but then Dragon Ball Superhero, if you want to include that continuity, said that he died in some kind of accident. So overall, the fact of the matter is that Jiro may have kept him around because of that reason, and that's the reason why, even though he was a failure, he didn't dispose of 16. Now, a lot of people will say that 16 did not actually exist in the other timelines. And, basically what ends up happening, as we're seeing here while I'm talking about that, is that the androids rebelled just like they did in the future timeline, and they go to wake 16 up. Now, I'll get into why it doesn't really make sense for him to have not existed in the other timelines, but basically this leads to the scene in which Trunks freaks out, gets his iconic "no" moment and blasts it, and it does nothing. Even Krillin's pointing out how stupid he is, much like how he points out that Vegeta's being dumb trying to attack Super Perfect Cell later in the arc. But nonetheless, they take 16 out, they wake him up, and what ends up happening? He gets out of this confinement, and immediately they're asking him questions, and he's not responding. They're wondering how he feels to be free. Zero answer. They are asking him exactly why he would be able to destroy all of them, and 16 doesn't respond to this either. Instead, he just smiles at 18. So again, maybe 16 realizes that Jiro's cover for why he didn't activate 16 in the first place was all incorrect, that he wouldn't actually destroy all of them, and rather that was just him making that up because he didn't want them to wake up 16. Maybe because also it played into another plot of Jiro, or another kind of backup that he initiated, which I'll get into soon as well. But again, Jiro's creation, 16, only really answers when they ask about killing Goku, where 17 says, "You were created to kill Son Goku too, weren't you?" And 16 says, "Yeah." So he definitely had that purpose. They immediately go off to try and do that. And interestingly, 16 also begins to explain how he was made to be. Because 17 wants to go on kind of a joyride to steal a car, or at least to walk to try and find Goku and just turn it into a game. 18's kind of going against this, saying, "Oh, you're still part human, that male love of pointless amusement." And so what does 17 say? "You understand me, don't you, 16? You were created from a human male too." 16 says, "No, I was created from nothing." This shocks 17, who's like, "You're not made from a human base?" And then 18 says, "Then you're fundamentally different from us." And 17's internal monologue says, "I never knew Dr. Jiro had the technology to create an android from nothing. Then why did he go back to cybernetics?" Now, this is something that is never actually explained to us in universe. Why did Jiro continue to diverge from the different paths? After all, he had made 17 and 18 to be incredibly powerful as infinite energy models, and yet he abandoned 17 and 18's type when he turned himself into a energy absorbing model, just like Android 19, which is mentioned at another point by 17, I believe, to be a prior version of a android. Interestingly, too, we end up seeing that 16 is far more powerful than 17 or 18. So again, why did Jiro create 17 and 18 after 16 when in fact he was so much more powerful than they ended up being? And realistically, why would he have even, try to use humans in the first place, when wouldn't a android like 16 theoretically be easier to control? So that raises a lot of questions that are never answered, because Vegeta jumps in to stop Toriyama from having to think of that and begins the fights. As we see, 16 refuses to get involved, even to the shock of 17 and 18, because of the fact that he says he will not, because the only time he ever wants to fight is going to be against Son Goku. And, another thing I have to bring up too is that theory that I mentioned before, where a lot of people suggest that it would be the chance that 16 did not actually exist in the other timelines because he was never created. Obviously, that makes zero sense because we know that these are called 17 and 18. So there had to be an Android 16 created before them. Otherwise, there'd be Android 16 and 17, not 17 and 18. Now, it is possible, perhaps, that Dr. Gero actually did make it to where 16 was disassembled or completely gotten rid of. Maybe after, again, the thing that we see in the background. I chose this image for a reason, guys, because the fact that Goku in the original timeline in the history of Trunks died before 17, 18, 19, 20, any of them were ever unleashed upon the Earth. So it's possible that Gero was still saving 16 as his ultimate way of possibly defeating Goku, just in case maybe 17 and 18 failed. Another contingency, just like Cell, for example, who was created with the ability to absorb 17, 18 into himself, which again could be because Gero saw ahead of in time, ironically, and realized that they would probably turn against him and maybe even kill him in the future. So his son, in a sense, would avenge him, kind of like in that classic, mythological way, and then in turn would be able to either defeat the androids or possibly even defeat Cell, because as we go on to see in a little bit, Android 16 is way more powerful than even base Cell when he first, awakens from his larval state, shall we say. So it's possible that that's the reason why 16 isn't present, because Gero just, said basically screw it after everything that happened with, Goku dying. Maybe he had something in place to actually tell him that his arch nemesis died, because even though he wasn't following him after Namek, he probably knew at that point that something would have alerted him, which also could have led to, as I discussed in another video you could see in the top right corner, the reason for why 17, 18 probably were released differently. Whereas in the original timeline and the History of Trunks timeline, 17, 18 killed Gero and then escaped and then attacked the city where all the other Z fighters were wiped out. Obviously, that was a lot different in the main timeline, perhaps because of time travel. Because after all, there is a really interesting little tidbit that you could see right here. Let me actually find that so I can show people, because they have their minds blown, utterly blown. Which is that in this manga panel where we have Dr. Gero going to his laboratory for the start of this chapter and leading to the introduction of Android 16, we have this little thing down below, the title of the chapter, which is, what exactly? A Sound of Thunder. Why is that important? Because the Sound of Thunder is where we actually get the term butterfly effect. A Sound of Thunder is the story about people going back in time and hunting dinosaurs because they were originally going to be wiped out. However, somebody, when they go back in time, accidentally kills a butterfly during this, which when they go back to the future has rippling effects that went from just that butterfly dying to things being spelled differently, and then suddenly T-Rex is still existing and killing the main characters. So everything about this has to do with the butterfly effect, where we see that things are drastically different in the main timeline comparative to what Trunks saw. We saw that with Android 20 or Android 19 right here, and perhaps Android 20, because again, 1920 in Trunks' timeline, aside from the initial time where he mentioned this to Goku, were not the ones who actually attacked at the city. Rather, it was 17 and 18. So again, a lot of things rippled and changed over time, which is why we end up seeing things being so different. The androids in this timeline are different. They escaped under different circumstances. The Z fighters already knew about them, so they showed up at the lab as opposed to the other way around. The androids only fought out of self-defense. They defeated everyone, and as we saw, they decided to make a game out of things, not killing any of the Z fighters in this version of the timeline, and instead going about things differently. Krillin even asked them exactly what their goal was. He says, for example, why go after Goku? Dr. Gero is the one you hated and he killed him, and 17's explaining that this is all a game to them. It's just for fun, and finding him is a part of that. Even Krillin says right here, and even if I begged you not to, 16 says, it doesn't matter, we are created to defeat Son Goku. So again, all these things are different. And as I was just talking about the whole thing that everything was different in this scenario, what exactly does Kami, the god of the earth who's observing everything, even say when Piccolo shows up to merge with him? Well, when Piccolo wants to do this, Kami says that rather he'd wait and see if this version of the androids are actually harmful to the Earth. Piccolo is detesting this, or protesting this rather, he also is detesting it. And what does Kami say? You started the fight. And even then they didn't kill you. Yes, I heard that these androids are slightly different from those that Trunks knew. And so he's waiting on his decision before anything happens. And over time we see that Android 16 is going along with everything with the fun of 17 and 18, and he starts to have a positive influence. And going back to that idea of what I mentioned before, where essentially the androids in the future were different, as I discussed in that video I mentioned earlier, the reason for that could also be, as many people point out in the comments on that video, that 16 was not actually present there, because either the androids didn't wake him up when they themselves escaped from Dr. Gero's captivity, or he was already disassembled, or maybe they destroyed him by accident when destroying the laboratory and escaping. Who really knows? But the fact of the matter is the kind-hearted 16 wasn't there to play off of them, to engage in fun with them, to help them out. Instead, he ends up not being a part of the factor at all. But why are things so different in terms of the butterfly effect here? Well, it's not just Trunks, it's also the other person who actually created the timeline, and maybe I should say the other monster in this case, which is Cell, who used the other time machine to go back to 1 year before Trunks originally arrived, and thus creating a new timeline in this case, which caused, as Trunks said, history to change so much. And even Kami was observing this the entire time, seeing that for the past 4 years he had been observing a strange uneasiness that wasn't simply the android. So the entire time Cell was on the Earth underground, and then he woke up shortly after this, and that caused things to ripple and change even more, which could have led to 16 being around, as we see right here. Again, Toriyama with this great idea of showcasing Cell going from his egg to his larval state, and finally this form, and then we spend the entire rest of the arc seeing his forms changing too. And over time, we also get insight into 16's abilities. Not only is he more powerful than 17 and 18, but whereas neither of them have the ability to sense energy, again, maybe because of the fact that if they did, they would actually interpret or be able to see Cell sneaking up on them and then absorbing them, which again, Dr. Gero could have been playing that 4D chess, pointing at his head, which Cell will get to do later on. But the fact of the matter is, 16 actually can sense that. So again, maybe 16 was also a hedge against Cell in that sense, to where he's able to see that Cell is one of the beings that's fighting with Piccolo, the nameless Namekian at this point after he merged with Kami, and he automatically knows that one of them rivals 17 and 18 in terms of power. And 17, of course, doesn't really have any idea just how powerful 16 is. He's super not only arrogant, but also is confident in his power and doesn't realize that not only can someone actually rival him as Piccolo, but additionally that 16 is far outside of his scope. But again, 16 is able to immediately tell this isn't Piccolo. He could sense his power. He sees just how much of a threat he really is to 17. And not just that, but when Cell shows up, what exactly happens? Well, strangely, even Cell was completely unaware of the existence of 16, despite the fact that Dr. Gero programmed the supercomputer to give him information just like 17 and 18. So again, why didn't he tell him? Because when he's scanning everyone, he just sees in confusion 16. He says, who's that? He bears the red ribbon emblem, so he must be another one of Dr. Gero's androids. In any case, he's an old model. I can safely ignore him. Of course, he would go on to be wrong, because even though he powers up to full, we see just how shocked Piccolo is, but 16, on the other hand, he's assessing the situation and he knows exactly what he's probably going to have to do soon, which is After Cell is beating down Piccolo and 17, he is completely unharmed by Piccolo's full power on display. 16 says right here, finally deciding to step up, he's going to destroy Cell, and the time has come for him to fight before I meet Son Goku. So again, I think this is more of an example of possibly leading into that theory I was proposing earlier, that 16 actually was also a hedge against Cell in order to stop him, just in case maybe he went too rogue and could have been a threat to Dr. Gero. But again, it could also be, instead of that, him learning more and more about the value of human life, because he starts to view 17, 18 as his friends, maybe even brother and sister, because again, they were essentially created in a sense by Dr. Gero. So he steps up, and, you know, nobody seems to think at the time that he's going to actually be able to do anything against Cell. But what does he do? He punches Cell away. And we see just how powerful 16 is on display. As he explains right here, if I've calculated correctly, my power is equal to Cell's. 17 is shocked because he's like, how is that even possible? You know, I'm stronger than you, of course, but that's not what we see, because 16, you know, Cell at first tries to absorb him, but can't, because 16 is fully mechanical, and 16 immediately gets to work. He rips off Cell's tail, Cell is able to regenerate it, and then we start to see some of these incredible powers on display. And you just have to think just how big of a threat 16 would have been if he was alive and around in those other timelines, because he was way more powerful than 17 and 18. And as I discussed in my video in the top right, there's a chance that 17 and 18 were actually the same level of power in the other timelines, and Trunks simply misinterpreted everything, like he does a lot in this arc. And so 16 is way more powerful than all the Super Saiyans and Piccolo as the Nameless Namekian at this time, and is equivalent to this Cell after he absorbed hundreds of thousands of people before he showed up in order to absorb 17 when he sensed him fighting Piccolo. So again, well, he sensed Piccolo, not 17. But again, the fact of the matter is, this guy would have destroyed everyone. Like, everyone combined wouldn't have been able to stop this dude. You know, like, they would have had to go into the time chamber and train for that year, or at least for a number of months, before they would have been able to defeat 16. And even then, he has other contingencies I'll get into soon. And just imagine if one of these attacks were to hit Goku or somebody else, they would instantly be wiped out. Now, with that being said, 17 and 18 are eventually absorbed by Cell, and so 16's power becomes kind of irrelevant at this point. However, he does become a protagonist and eventually joins everyone at the Cell games. And when it comes time to the Cell games, we do see more of his character development on display, where he essentially has become a good guy, thanking Krillin for the help. Now the red ribbon symbol has been replaced with kind of a slapped-on sticker, it looks like, for the Capsule Corp. And then Goku actually reaches out to shake his hand and say, let's do our best, but 16 looks at him kind of discriminately, and he says, I was created to kill you, Son Goku. Don't ever forget that. So you do have to wonder how hard he's struggling right now in order to resist that. Would he have eventually given in after the threat of Cell ceased to be, in order to want to destroy Goku, assuming that Goku had survived everything in the first place, and so did 16? That's a question. Or did 16 truly develop such a conscience at this point that he was able to override this and make it to where he no longer saw Goku as a target, despite the fact that, you know, kind of like Piccolo, he was created in order to destroy Goku in the first place. So that's an interesting thing. Again, we see a lot of great character development for 16 over the course of this story, again, like Arnold in Terminator 2. But then we finally see the last actions of 16 on display, where we see him grab Cell and then go to detonate his bomb. Now the question here is, would 16's bomb actually have been able to really do anything if he still had it? He seems to be under the impression that he would have been able to not only kill Cell, but destroy everyone else, and maybe even destroy the Earth, depending upon the translation. And he's going to be sacrificing all of them in order to save the entire universe. So, like he says right here, none of you could survive a blast at such close range. So, I guess this bomb must have been so powerful that it would have been able to wipe out even these super powerful planet-busting characters like the Z-Fighters. However, we never actually got to see that happen because Bulma and her father actually removed it when they were fixing him. So as a result, we didn't see it happen, but there is a lot of skepticism here that he would have been able to even really hurt or kill Cell because of what Cell says right here. Too bad, Metal Man. Of course, no little bomb blast would kill me. Ironically, we do get to see Cell, in kind of a bomb blast blowing himself up a little bit later on, where what ends up happening is, well, he survives and comes back even stronger. So for all we know, 16 might have blown himself up, Cell's core might have survived, and maybe everyone else would have died, potentially, but Cell would have survived, and 16 would have only helped to make him even stronger. So that's something to consider, especially if you check out my video in the top right about how Zenkais work in Dragon Ball. Cheap plug. But of course, Cell does go on to destroy 16, except for his head, which is all that he needs at this point. And 16 ends up being one of the biggest contributors of this entire story arc, as what we end up seeing is that 16 gives a speech to Gohan telling him that he needs to set his passions free, to not hold back against somebody like Cell because words will never reach him, and that he should probably use his power to protect the wild animals, the forest, and everything else that he loved. Protect them for him as he passes himself on, as Cell defeats him and destroys him, just like Android 17 did. I also discussed that in another video in the top right. So many videos I'm discussing. And this, of course, leads to Gohan snapping and unleashing his Super Saiyan 2, his most iconic transformation and one of the most iconic moments in the entire franchise. And of course, after this point, Android 16 would cease to be a part of the story, dead or destroyed, terminated, and never brought back. But you do have to wonder exactly what kind of impact he would have left on the story had he still remained. But it definitely is interesting to think about exactly what would have happened if Android 16 did stick around. On one hand, I do think it would have been awesome to see him be a part of the story, maybe being upgraded over time by Bulma and Dr. Brief to be a valuable component in the Z-Fighters, and also to help them, to give his own perspectives, constantly analyzing things. He could have been a kind of like Piccolo type character, and seeing his android self going against somebody like Boo, who probably wouldn't even be able to absorb him or really make any kind of improvement upon himself because of the purely mechanical versus the purely magical. But overall, he didn't end up being a part of the story, and I feel like in some ways that's also good because, much like Cell, until the recent movie, he was never actually brought back, and thus his death was way more substantive. And even Cell wasn't brought back, that was Cell Max. But nonetheless, that is why 16 was not in Dragon Ball's other timelines, and also what probably would have happened if he was. Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Make sure to like this video, share it out, and subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, it's time to bring back the muscular Android 16 with his massive mechanical biceps and triceps, and especially those pecs.